So after having thought and read again the sources that you shared, and having thought how I could actually build something more general, of a general use, and not only something which is related to the place, to a single place, I started to have several ideas, and I came out with this concept, which I will share you, as the time is not so much, and I will need a feedback. So the stories of From the Deep Time is based on this concept of passing from analyzing temporalities in the landscape, as I was mainly doing before, to analyzing temporalities as a landscape. So spatializing the temporalities of not a landscape, but in this case of objects. The concept will be to build spatial representations of temporalities embedded in the objects, to allow to highlight the deep time and how deep time permeate everything. So to have a more deep relation with HCI and design, because in example this idea could be used from a designer which is engaging with some design and some project to analyze his project and analyze how the time and the temporalities are permeating his design. Or it can also be used as a critical artifact to analyze existing objects and projects, to deconstruct them and unpack the temporalities that the objects brings with it. I took inspiration, as we said several times, from the dioramas, and especially from this little abstract landscape, also from something more figurative as the first image. But I think that figurativeness is not the best to build something general. And so I think the concept of the first image is useful for the mechanism of how the various layers can be piled, while shapes inspired to the second or the third image can be more generative for narrating stories. So I just started with some quick early prototypes to schematize the idea, which is building layers, and each layers can be assigned to a material of the object that we are analyzing, and placing them along an hypothetical timeline from the more recent to the more ancient materials, based on how these materials are formed and when they formed. So I just had some other iteration of this idea with shapes, and here is a small representation of how these layers should be packed. So materials that engage with temporalities of years, of thousands of years, of millions of years, of hundreds of millions of years are aligned in a timeline. And the problem is also that I got a bit into I was iterating with shapes, and I used at first the shapes from the postcards I designed. I got the idea that simplifying is better. Sometimes I really overcomplicate, so I try to abstract. And abstracting the shapes, I got into a phases of synthesis, which is represented by this scheme, and which can be useful for understanding better the concept. So each not each material, but I can create categories for materials, for example, which belongs to certain temporalities. In example, materials that are made ultimately from petroleum, from oil, can be assigned to the geological deep, because they engage with 10 to hundreds of millions of years. While, for example, organic material can be related to the ephemeral or the human category. And in this way, I can try to categorize and layer the materials. this is an example to make it more explicit that I tried. So I could try to depict some landscape of the objects. So passing each object will be a different landscape, and each landscape will be formed by the shapes assigned to the material category. I call them like archetypical material to also relate with architecture. In this case, the marker has four archetypical material, as you see, and each one with its temporality, and the IKEA lamp as well, and the shear source as well. To link this with the storytelling, and especially with the narrative from Rings of Saturn, which is very interesting, I thought that I could use those kind of little landscape to brainstorm or to create little stories. So assigning to each interval, so each material, a small text, a small narrative, and try to build a coherent story, which is not mandatory related to some topics, but it's more about the evolution of this landscape. So I could narrate the evolution of this landscape, or could narrate some other specific aspect which I have to develop eventually, but this was just a try of how this landscape, I put myself there, like on reflecting and looking at each shape, and I built a conceptual story coming from that. So I also write some rules for this game. First, there is a potential technological layer on top of this, because the materials that I analyze, they come from artificial intelligence analysis of the material for now, which is not mandatory, but for me was very easy. It's something I created some time ago to just have fun. So I have created a prompt through which I have a chat in where I upload a photo, and it gives me back the temporalities embedded in that objects, analyzing and unpacking all the materials. So this is how I can build this list of materials. They came out from my picture, from the picture given to the artificial intelligence. This could be easily replaced by some database, for example. So this would imply to have like a companion app or something similar. So first step, this. Then you examine the object, you select the shapes, and you create your own landscape assemblage. So this concept also is based on Anat Singh landscape assemblages. And then you take the collage, you assign a postcard eventually that I could also create to help the narration, which I still didn't do, but it could be, for example, the postcards that I created up until now, and the person can tell a story of the deep time in this way. I also developed a bit more the concept, trying to make it more precise, and I was iterating with this little 3D model where I can build like a chamber. In this case will be properly a diorama inspired to the paper theaters. In this case the length of the parallelepiped will be 50 centimeters, and in these 50 centimeters 70 actually, because the 50 centimeters are for the interval. And this is a logarithmic scale I created through some mathematics, simple. And I tried here to design several shapes. I would have to iterate a lot on the shapes because maybe they don't make sense, but I think that the result is kind of improving. And even though the idea is very new and maybe there is no time, I find it very generative. I am having a lot of ideas to make it better, and there are obviously some problems. So I would lose in this way the explicit connection to the Santa Cruz geological landscape, or to whatever like landscape I am analyzing through the mapping phase. So I got some ideas, I don't know, using real shapes and characters from that place instead of abstract silhouettes. For example, in Santa Cruz, I can use dinosaurs, animals, the plants from from the various geological eras, some rocks. I could take pictures and cut out some silhouettes, for example. Or maybe the idea of deconstructing the object should be abandoned because it's too late to implement some big change like this. So I could come back to the to the initial idea and eventually referring to the first image on the left. So build little dioramas of the specific landscape I'm analyzing. But in this case, I find it harder to make a connection to deep time design thinking. That's why I started to shift a bit. And this is the idea.